Good morning. Welcome to Plugged In. We will be doing another story of Jacob right after this. And good morning. We are glad that you're with us. Hey, the sun is out. I mean, like the last few days have been rather gloomy. There's been moments of sunshine, but it is so refreshing to see it. It is New Year's Eve. Tomorrow is New Year's Eve. Have you made your resolutions? Don't give up on those. Don't give up on making some. Some people will say, well, what's the use of making one? We're just going to go back to our old ways. Well, that's not much self-control or willpower there. So I want to encourage you to be thinking of some things for 2025 that you would like to do differently in a more positive way to help in the family and help in the community, to help make this a better place and land that we live in, and or to just better yourself out, and especially in your relationship with the Lord. We can always improve with that. But it's good to be with you today. Just as another short lesson. It'll be coming from Genesis 32. In just a few moments, I'll be reading a section out of that. We've been talking about Jacob. I've been looking at this series about faith, and we talked about Esau and Jacob and their faith, and how Esau was the one that was supposed to get the blessing. It was Jacob that stole it from him. His mom kind of helped with that. Isaac gave to him the blessing. And so when that happened, Esau was bound and determined to get even with Jacob. And Rebekah said to Jacob, hey, you need to run. You need to go hide. You stay with with your uncle Laban. So he does that. And then about chapter 32, we find that he's going to meet up with Esau, and he's gained some collateral. He's gained some material possessions, and he's going to try to woo Esau with those. He's going to try to smooth things over with that. But before I read for you the rest of that story, I recall when I was growing up, I was born in 66, and so great eras to grow up in the 70s and 80s. And so if I'm talking to those of you who, graduated like in the mid 80s, man, those were wonderful years. But I recall in the 70s when we would go and visit my grandparents down in Houston, Missouri, especially if it was on the weekend, one of the highlights was for my grandfather and I to sit down in the afternoons and watch wrestling on TV. Now, in those days, you had three channels, ABC, NBC, and CBS. So afternoon Saturdays was NBC wrestling matches. And so there was a lot of crazy characters in those days. There was a man named Abdullah the Butcher, or Gorilla Monsoon. There was the Crusher. There was Black Jack Mulligan. Of course, one of the more famous ones was Andre the Giant. We also had this favorite character named Skandar Akbar. He wore a mask, and people were trying to pull the mask off of him to find out his true identity. And that just moved into the 80s. You had people like Randy Macho Man Savage and Iva Koloff, the Russian Bear, and the Honky Tonk Man and the Junkyard Dog. But of course, in the 80s and early 90s, the most famous wrestler was Hulk Hogan. Now, I don't know if you're still into wrestling. For a little while, when my youngest daughter was like first and second grade, one of our highlights on Monday nights was to watch Monday Night Raw. Okay, John Cena that's when he really came on the scene. And so she enjoyed watching him do this little thing with his hand. And I don't know if my wife really appreciated that we watched the show, but we enjoyed those great memories. But if we go to Genesis 32, we find another wrestler, and he doesn't have any great name. He's just called Jacob. But Jacob is not wrestling with just anyone. Jacob is wrestling with God. And so here's how the story plays out. That night, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives and 2 female servants and his 11 sons, and they crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had seen them across the stream, he sent over all of his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And the man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. And the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. This man that Jacob is wrestling with is just not any man. It is actually God that he's wrestling with. Why was it that God chose to wrestle with Jacob? Well, we could come up with a variety of reasons, but in doing some study, here's some things that I came up with. One of the things is that God wanted to show Jacob his strength, that is God's strength. Jacob was trying to do a lot of things on his own, and God wanted to prove his strength to Jacob. But God also wanted to show the strength of Jacob. In other words, Jacob was quite strong. In fact, he wrestled with God all night, and it somewhat overpowered him. God allowed for that to happen. He stayed in the match, so to speak. Okay? But he also wanted him to know that he could not fully defeat. His strength was not as good as God's. Another reason that he allowed for Jacob to wrestle with him, it might be to correct Jacob's lifelong pattern of struggling with people and with God. Jacob just had a hard time getting along with other individuals, some within his family, some outside the family, and then, of course, with God. Well, during the wrestling match, God humbled Jacob. And one of the biggest ways he humbled him by wrenching his hip. And this, too, was a reminder of God's power and also his favor in Jacob. Now, maybe you find yourself in a wrestling match of some sort. Maybe it's with a person. It may be with a problem. It might be a decision that you're going through. And maybe you are wrestling with God. If you notice in our story, God doesn't destroy Jacob. He does, though, cause for him some pain and some discomfort. Jacob would have a limp as a reminder of his wrestling with God. But Jacob would also have a new name. He would no longer be called Jacob. He would be called Israel. And God's love for Israel was great then and is great now. As we come to the end of the year here, it's time for resolutions. And so what are you resolving for this next year? Maybe it is to have a better relationship with a spouse or another family member. Maybe it's to reconcile with someone that there's been a differences of opinions or viewpoints on. Maybe a great resolution is your relationship with the Lord. And stop wrestling with him. I mean, I know there are going to be some things that he causes for us to do or think about that we wrestle with, but ultimately, let's humble ourselves before him, and what he will do is bless us. Thank you again for joining us all for 2024. We look forward to 2025, which is what it will be next week when I see you. So have a wonderful week. Enjoy the New Year's. Be safe, and we'll see you next week on Plugged In.